Welcome to HRA's podcast. I'm Rachel Smith, the CEO of Humane Research Australia, and today I'm really pleased to be speaking with Denise Russell, an academic with a specialism in ethics. So I'll start off by asking you the question, Denise. Can you tell me about your background and how you came to be interested in the issue of animal experimentation?
Yes, thank you for the invitation to speak. I taught philosophy at Sydney University for over 20 years, and during that time, I was exposed to a lot of philosophical positions where the writers tried to distinguish humans from animals, obviously putting humans up on a pedestal as opposed to animals, on various bases, like they don't have language, they don't use tools, they don't have intelligence, etc., etc. And I thought, there was room there to critique those positions. And so I thought I'd set up a course in that area. But then also I was exposed to a lot of ethical issues in relation to animals independent from philosophy, like the battery hen situation, the problem with zoos, the whaling situation, and so on. So I thought, well, I could do a course partly on philosophical positions concerning how animals are different from humans and partly on ethical issues. And so I set up a course called Humanity and Animality as a second, third year option in philosophy at Sydney Uni. It was very popular. A lot of students did the course. And in the course of doing that, I worked out that not many people really were going into the question of ethics in relation to experimentation.
Okay, yeah.
And so I thought, well, I should be looking into that area because it, is not given the weight that, say, battery hen issues are given and so on. And so that's how I got into it, really. Wanting to draw in a lot of questions about animal ethics and then seeing that was quite a poorly researched area. And so I wanted to be able to contribute to that.
Yes, I see. Thank you. So that was more your initiation than the students coming to you?
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you, Denise. And I want to expand and talk a little bit about animal ethics committees, or AECs,
Yes.
or animal care and ethics committees, as they're also known. Have you personally sat on a AEC?
Yes. It's quite some time ago now, but I'm talking with friends who have been associated more recently with animal ethics committees. Very little has changed.
Okay, so what was your experience?
Well, it was really terrible, actually. I could go on and on about it, but I found that the people on the committee mostly didn't want to hear any questions about the ethical implications of the research being proposed, didn't want to talk about them, partly because of time. You might be asked to go through 20 protocols in a 2-hour session, but partly because of lack of interest, really. And then the people who were on the committee who weren't necessarily in favour of the research going ahead on ethical grounds, like the animal welfare representative or the vet, were often just silent, just felt intimidated by the scientists on the committee. So it was a very draining experience.
Yeah, I'll ask you a little bit more about it now, but I'm just interested to know. So, did you find that personal experience? If you raised the question, was it seriously considered, or were you shut down, or a mixture?
Well, there was an attempt to shut me down, but I'm quite an assertive person in that situation.
Yes.
So they had some trouble. But then, I was causing a lot of dissension on the committee because of partly the fact that they wanted to get through so many protocols in one session.
Yes.
And also that they were adverse to talking about ethics. I mean, one of the scientists on the committee, actually from psychology, said to me when I was questioning the learned helplessness experiments on dogs, where they give them electric shocks, so often that they just give up.
Yeah.
When I was questioning this, he said, look, I suppose you're going to question my research protocol, which is coming up at the next meeting, because I'm doing this research as well. As if that was a reply to a question about the ethics of the research.
Yeah.
So it was very, very difficult.
Yes,
Yeah.
it sounds it. And obviously you've answered that you've been on an AEC.
Yes.
Do you have any other knowledge on the workings of AECs other than that personal experience through your academic role or teaching, and how did you gain that knowledge?
Yeah. Well, just several things I learned by being on the committee. One of them was about confidentiality. I, in fact, was a bit deceitful in that I kept on putting off signing the confidentiality agreement because I figured that right from the beginning that I was going to have trouble with the committee, but everybody on the committee is supposed to sign this agreement that they won't talk about the discussion in the committee to other academics or the public.
Yeah.
So, if you have problems with the workings of the committee, you've got to face it yourself or talk about it with other members on the committee. But if they're hostile to your position, that's not going to get very far.
Yeah.
So that was one of them. But also there are lots of other problems too, like there's supposed to be a member on there who's independent, and that was supposed to be my status. But I was on the committee at Sydney University, which was the same institution that I was teaching at, so I wasn't independent from the institution.
Yeah.
All the research protocols that come up for the committee, they've got funding approval, or nearly all of them have already got funding approval. So you can imagine if somebody from outside the discipline of science says, oh no, we can't pass that protocol because it's going to cause too much animal suffering. You can imagine the reaction that the scientists would have to that. This protocol has research funding. It's good for the scientists, it's good for the department, it's good for the university.
Yeah.
And you're saying that can't go ahead because a few dozen rats are going to suffer. So it was very, very hard to face the criticism that it would be just such a scandal to knock back research at this stage. At the stage of the Animal Ethics Committee.
Yes, because it's that, as you say, that final stage. Was there any instances where there was a project that was rejected in its entirety? No. Okay.
No. And I've kept in touch with friends who've been on the committees, and nobody reports projects that have been rejected in their entirety. Because it's basically the end of the stage for approval for research. And this is one of the huge problems I see, and why in the end I just had to get out.
Yeah.
If the funding body, the main funding body, as you know, is the NHMRC, National Health and Medical Research Council, and they don't have anything to do with ethics. A physician in Sydney who is very concerned about this, Anne Keogh, and I contacted the NHMRC and said, you think that ethics should come into decisions about what research goes ahead. What are you doing about it? And they sent a letter to us saying, oh, no, we don't do anything about it. That's up to the Animal Ethics Committee.
Yes, or left in their hands, yeah.
It's the end of the line for approval.
Yeah.
And that's the only point where ethics is coming in, and that's the big problem, I think.
Yes. And you've touched a little bit upon this. I'll just ask if you have anything else to add in terms of, do you feel the operations of AECs are transparent enough? And I know you mentioned the confidentiality agreement, and do you have anything to add to that?
Well, no, they're absolutely not transparent enough, because the members of the public don't know what goes on in the discussions, so they can't be assured that there is justification for the research and the suffering that it's going to incur. I mean, we had an example down here. I'm now at the University of Wollongong. We had an example here where research on kangaroos was put forward as a research protocol. Funding was attached to it. And these kangaroos were going to be kept for 9 months in a box, something like 1.5 by 2 metres by 1.9 metres or something, in order to test their methane emissions.
Oh, yeah.
The committee didn't knock that back. But I have friends in the admin at the university, and they told me that the research couldn't be supported by the university because it would be scandalous in the eyes of the public if it got out.
Okay.
Well, the independent member on the committee also thought this and went to Animal Liberation, who then broke the news. It was in about 12 newspapers. And the university then was forced to stop the protocol going ahead. That's the only time I've ever heard of a research proposal being knocked back. And it wasn't knocked back by the committee. It was knocked back by the senior management because they were worried about the reputation of the university.
The response. And that person that leaked the information, were they able to remain on the committee, or was that the end of their time on the committee?
Interesting. I don't know, because then again, the constitution of the committees has been very kept in the secret, kept in the dark for many years. So I just don't know.
Okay.
I don't know exactly who the member was, and I don't know whether they stayed on the committee or not.
Okay. As I said, another example of the lack of transparency.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. But you know, the person who leaked the possibility of the research must have really, been torn by that, because he or she would have signed a confidentiality agreement in all probability, and thought that, they were going against that. Might have even faced disciplinary action, and still thought, I just can't sit on this committee and allow that research to go ahead.
A final measure. I mean, we haven't touched upon this so much, but I'm assuming that the decisions are not by consensus; it's by a majority vote. So if that person had spoken up, it would have still gone ahead regardless of their opposition.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, of course, the members who have the majority vote will try to get the others to come around, but it is by majority vote.
Yeah. So, based on your expertise, what is your assessment of the ability of animal ethics committees to provide an adequate regulatory framework for the use of animals in research and teaching? And we often hear it defended as a very robust framework. So I'm wondering what your view is on that from your experience.
Well, it's supposed to be modelled on 3 principles: refinement, reduction, and replacement. Refinement is, making sure the experiments are designed well, so you're not going to waste lives, etc. And reduction is reducing the number of animals that are used in the experiment as much as you can. And replacement is using non-animal techniques. Now, the refinement and reduction principles can be followed, and I think are followed reasonably well, both in research and teaching. It's the replacement one that I'm concerned about, because the scientists on the committee are scientists who are using animals. So they're not scientists who are involved in doing research in biology or physiology, psychology, not using animals. So I think that, there's a real limitation there, that they won't be able to make a good judgment about whether alternatives are available. Also, the researcher putting the protocol forward if they've decided they're going to use animals, they're coming from a traditional discipline of biology, psychology, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're not exposed to the new techniques,
Exactly, yes.
like sophisticated computer simulation or in vitro studies, something like that.
Yeah.
They're not exposed to that because they've come through a degree pattern where animals are used and this is the way things are done. So they are not in a position to know what alternatives are. So that they can't say, oh, I've looked at all the alternatives and they can't be used to study kidney disease, they say.
Mm-hmm.
But how would they know? Because their educational background has not been in
Yes.
the field of alternatives.
Yes, not up to speed with those developments.
No, no. Yes.
What would you say could be done to improve the effectiveness of AECs?
Well, I think that we shouldn't be having animal experimentation, so we won't be needing them.
Mm-hmm.
But short of that, I think that protocols should face some assessment before they go for the funding,
Yeah.
so that they can be screened for ethical issues at an early stage,
Sure.
and the proposals can be stopped if it appears to the committee screening these proposals that it's not justified research in terms of the suffering that can occur. Now, that would be difficult for the animal ethics committees as they're presently constituted because there are no scientists on them who are doing non-animal research.
Mm-hmm.
So they would have to be broader committees. And of course, all this is time consuming.
Yes.
and difficult, but I think it's absolutely necessary to do that because otherwise, if research has funding attached to it, there are too many incentives for everybody to let that research go through, no matter how problematic.
Yes, yeah, yeah. That makes sense, and I can see where the resistance would come from because they might see it as time consuming to be giving that rigor to a lot
Yes.
of applications before they get funding, but the alternative is that there's not enough scrutiny at the end stage, so it's either one or the other, I
Yes.
guess.
Yeah, that's right. But another thing that could happen, and I have written to the NH and MRC about this, and I think that they are improving a little bit, and that is for the NH and MRC to have targets to support research that doesn't use animals. And I must admit that over the years, they have been starting to give research funding to more projects that are not using animals.
Yeah.
So that would be a terrific way to go, because there has to be a switch in the mindset of people who want to study things like Parkinson's disease or depression or something else.
Yes.
So that they don't move into the field of animal research and that's it.
Yeah.
But have all these different ways of proceeding opening up to them. I mean, it's wonderful what's happening overseas, as I'm sure you know. In other countries, alternatives are being developed. And you can go right through medical degrees, for instance, in the US, in many places, without doing animal experimentation, because of wonderful computer simulation of human models, where they can train and have their mistakes corrected and so on, without having to use animals and the suffering that incurs. So Australia could do so much more than it is at the moment, following overseas ways of proceeding here.
Yes, definitely. And what advice would you give to a new member of an AEC with a genuine interest in representing the interests of animals in laboratories as well as scientifically valid science?
Well, it's difficult for me because I had to pull out because of my disagreement with the way that the committees work. So probably to try to get support for opening up questions of ethics. And maybe that could come, and it depends on the committee's constitution, maybe it could come from the person who is representing animal welfare, maybe it could come from the vet, maybe it could even come from some of the scientists. It's acting alone, which is very tricky, like the person down in Wollongong no doubt felt. If you are facing a committee of 12 people or something and you're the only one taking the stand, it's very, very tough. So I would say if they want to pursue that avenue of being on animal ethics committees, then I think it's a great idea to try to enlist the support of other people there. It's very tricky to say, oh, get support from outside because of the confidentiality agreement. Exactly. I mean, I was a bit devious in never signing that, but I wouldn't recommend that everybody do that.
Yeah.
So just try to get support from within the committee, I guess.
Yeah.
That would be the main thing I'd say.
Okay, that makes sense. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with the operations of human ethics committees, but do you feel there's anything that animal ethics committees could learn from human ethics committees?
Well, I'm not really familiar, except I've had students in philosophy who might have been doing work involving human research in feminist studies and so on. Mm-hmm. And the human ethics committees are, I think, a lot stricter than animal ethics committees. Yes. I mean, people sort of expect their protocols to be rejected first time around and this sort of thing. The risk assessment is that much more rigorous with humans than it is with animals. And, of course, there's the question of informed consent. Humans can give informed consent, but animals can't.
Of course.
So I think they're very, very different areas and different procedures occur because humans are valued so much more than animals, I guess.
Yeah. And I guess from HRA's perspective and experience, there appears to be variances between the research practices that some AECs approve and some reject.
Yes.
And the recent example is the forced swim test with the University of South Australia, Adelaide University and Griffith University.
Yes.
They no longer approve these protocols, but other universities have not taken the same stance. So how would you explain this discrepancy and what can be done to ensure more consistency, if indeed you feel more consistency is necessary?
Well, what can be done to ensure more consistency? I think it's never going to happen. While you get some people on the committee who are willing to listen to arguments about animal suffering, and others on the committee who are willing to give animal suffering such a low place, and this, makes a difference with human ethics committees as well. It's obvious that you will get discrepancy in the decisions. Newcastle was a shining example of having a good animal ethics committee, as opposed to the one at Sydney University some time ago. So they would have been making different decisions with different protocols, but different decisions.
Yeah.
I don't think that you're ever going to get unanimity in decisions when it's a question of, how do we weigh this suffering against the benefit of the research?
Yes.
And whether that's a good or bad thing, I don't know. I mean, it depends on the research project, I guess.
Yes, I think that's kind of the issue we face. We would love to see some statewide or national regulation on that particular test, but it's always up to the university's discretion, and they would probably argue that the protocol is applied in different ways with different levels of refinement, and for example, but it does mean that there's really some quite great variances, and those universities that have prohibited the procedure don't necessarily want to speak out or give any opinion on the other universities. So
yes. But look, there was a model, wasn't there, with was it the Dre's test with
Mm-hmm.
rabbits? Where they were testing products on rabbits' eyes and causing a great deal of suffering. And I think that test was um, banned, but that was mainly done in the commercial sphere
Yeah.
rather than in the university institutional
Yes.
sphere.
Yeah.
But that was an example of how there was a blanket sort of prohibition, wasn't there? Or am I
Yes, well, I
misremembering?
think the situation is that there's some variances with the state legislation. Some of them approve it with ministerial approval,
I
and
see.
some states don't have any mention of it at all in their legislation. I think that's probably the states that aren't
Right.
where they haven't really had so many applications for its use, but
I see.
typically it's dependent on ministerial approval now, so it's not been banned outright, although there is
Okay.
a validated alternative in place. So there's still the discretion to
Right.
use it with ministerial approval. And obviously, when we're trying to get evidence of those applications to the minister, we are refused. But it is,
Yes.
yeah, unfortunately,
Yes.
still happening in some cases.
Right. Yes.
Um, So, my next question is: in some countries, there is a requirement for a regulatory body to approve each research project rather than it being at the discretion of an institutional AEC, for example, in the UK, where the Home Office would have oversight over individual projects. Do you feel
Yes.
this additional layer of oversight would be beneficial in Australia?
Well, yes, I do, because of one thing that I said before. It would be uh, a way of introducing ethical approval at an earlier stage. And also, another problem with the research protocols is that there's not enough exposure of other research. I mean, it's sometimes difficult for researchers to know whether they're duplicating
Yes.
what other
Mm.
researchers have already done. And so, say if other researchers have found that it was useless using baboons to study Parkinson's
Mm-hmm.
disease, then it would be useful for the researcher coming in to know that is not a fruitful line of inquiry. If you had a regulatory body outside of the institutions, they could have a data bank of the research that went through them, and that could save overlapping studies. It could save duplication
Mm.
of studies, especially where there had been no fruitful results.
Yep. Yep. I think that's a
Mm,
good point. I hadn't thought of. Obviously, it would depend on the ability of that regulatory body to actually be meaningful in their actions. I think I read recently about the Home Office, and they hadn't rejected one single project application in 2020, but
yes,
it would depend on how forthful they and how rigorous they were as well. But
yes,
it
absolutely,
sounds in theory
absolutely,
like it
yeah,
would be an extra layer.
yeah. But this all of this lack of rejection of research is partly because the public have the wool pulled over our eyes, thinking that everything is okay.
Mm,
And so there isn't any public outcry about the number of animals who are dying or suffering in the research that's being carried out. If more of that is made public, like your wonderful organisation is doing, then there might over time get to be more of a movement to open up
mm,
what's happening in research and then questioning a lot of what is going ahead.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you, Denise. I just wondered if you had any final thoughts you would like to share. And I know you had an initiative in the past, a website with different resources and on alternatives, for
Yeah,
example. I'd be interested to know the
yes.
response that you got to those resources, or indeed anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to add that I found the experience of being on an animal ethics committee absolutely um, terrible. And I was very disenchanted
Mm,
about the committee holding up the possibility of considering animal suffering. Sydney University may have been worse than others. It certainly was worse than Newcastle at the time I was there. But,
Yeah.
I suspect that the general problem is there overall nationally.
Yes.
So one of the things I tried to do is set up a website of alternatives to act as a sort of knowledge base for people who wanted to pursue things in a different way. So can I just give you the web address for that?
Yes, please do. Yes.
Okay, so it's http alternatives to animal testing in australianresearch.org.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's a great initiative and much needed. Hope
So
it's referred to.
is your booklet. It was really good.
Thank
It
you.
came out of Humane Research, yes.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
And anything else you'd like to share that you think may be of interest to our listeners?
Just keep in there fighting for animals because it's so important. There is so much suffering, and it's not like animal experimentation is decreasing.
No.
With all the move into genetics, there is an even broader demand for animals to be used in research, even though they don't share the same genes as humans. So it's a continuing battle,
Yes.
like the battle to end battery hand farming and so on. It goes on and on. But it's really important for people to keep in there fighting it because there is so much suffering that is incurred in this area.
Yes, well, thank you for that message and thank you for your time in being interviewed today. I found it really interesting and we'd like to say thank you for all you've done and for the information that you've shared with us and for your support and for standing up for animals who unfortunately still used in research today.
Thank you very much, Rachel.